Her hands would not stop shaking, and the candle she carried nearly slipped from her fingers as the clock in the hall struck midnight. Elena Whitmore had not slept in 3 days. Not truly slept. She had closed her eyes on the hard wooden chair beside her mother's bed, waking every hour to check if the fever had broken, waking again to the sound of her little brother crying from hunger in the next room. Her fingers were raw from needle pricks, her eyes burned from the candlelight she used long after the rest of the house had gone dark, stitching gowns for women who would never know her name. She worked for a dressmaker on Colford Street, a stern woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who paid little and demanded much. Elena did not complain. She could not afford to. Her father had died 2 winters ago, leaving behind debts that swallowed everything he had built, and since then, it had fallen to Elena, the eldest of 3, to keep her family from the workhouse. Her mother, Margaret, had once been strong, but grief and hardship had worn her down until she could barely rise from her bed. Her sister Lucy was 12, her brother Henry only 9. They depended on her completely, and Elena had learned to swallow her exhaustion the way other people swallowed bread, quickly, without tasting it, simply because there was no choice. That night, she had been given an order that could not wait. A gown, urgently altered, needed at the Ashbourne estate before the grand ball the following evening. Mrs. Aldridge had handed her the parcel with a warning: "Deliver it yourself, and do not be seen. The Duke's household does not deal with shopgirls at the front door." Elena had walked nearly 2 miles in the cold to reach the estate. The parcel clutched against her chest like something precious, because in a way it was. If she failed to deliver it, Mrs. Aldridge would dismiss her without a second thought. And then what would become of her mother, her sister, her brother? She could not let herself imagine it. She simply walked faster. The Ashbourne estate rose out of the darkness like something from a story she used to tell Lucy at bedtime, back when there had been time for stories. Carriages were already beginning to arrive, though the ball itself was still a day away, for it seemed the household was preparing early, testing decorations, rehearsing music, filling the halls with the particular kind of nervous energy that came before something grand. She found the servants' entrance around the side, as she had been told, and knocked. A young footman answered, glanced at the parcel, and told her to wait. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Elena stood in the cold, her shawl too thin for the night air, and felt her legs begin to tremble beneath her, not from fear, but from sheer depletion. She had eaten nothing since morning. She had given the last of the bread to Henry. The door opened again, but not to the footman. A woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat knot stood there instead, dressed finely, but not extravagantly, the sort of dress that spoke of authority rather than wealth. This was Mrs. Fairweather, the housekeeper of Ashbourne House, though Elena did not yet know her name. "You look half frozen, child," the woman said, stepping aside. "Come in before you catch your death standing there." Elena hesitated. "I was only told to deliver the parcel, ma'am. I should not stay." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Fairweather. "The seamstress who altered Lady Constance's gown must confirm the fit before the ball, and Lady Constance will not be available until the morning. You will wait here tonight in the servants' quarters, and in the morning you will see to the final adjustments yourself. It is what the house requires, and I do not make exceptions for the weather or the hour." There was no room in her voice for argument, and in truth, Elena was too tired to offer one. She was led inside, past a kitchen alive with early preparations, past storerooms filled with candles and linens, until she reached a small room with a narrow bed. She was told to rest, that she would be called at first light. She meant only to rest her eyes for a moment. Instead, sleep took her entirely, deeper and darker than she had allowed herself in weeks, and when she woke, the light through the small window told her it was already well past morning. She sat up in a panic, certain she had failed, certain Mrs. Aldridge would hear of this and dismiss her before the day was through. But when she hurried into the corridor, she found the household already swept up in preparations far greater than she had expected. It was not merely a rehearsal the night before. The ball itself was tonight, and in her exhaustion, she had lost an entire day of urgency without knowing it. A young maid named Charlotte, not much older than Elena, found her wandering the corridor with wide, uncertain eyes and laughed gently. "You look lost," she said. "You must be the seamstress Mrs. Fairweather mentioned. Come, I will take you to Lady Constance's chambers, before she loses her patience entirely. She is not known for it." Elena followed, her heart hammering, still trying to steady herself after so deep a sleep. The gown fitting itself passed in a blur of pins and fabric, and Lady Constance's sharp, appraising eyes, a woman whose beauty was polished to a point that made Elena feel entirely invisible standing beside her. When it was finally done, Elena expected to be sent home. Instead, Mrs. Fairweather appeared once more with new instructions. The Duke's mother has asked that a seamstress remain on hand throughout the evening, in case any lady's gown requires attention, said the housekeeper. You will stay in the retiring room near the ballroom. It will not be difficult work, only watching and waiting, and you will be paid for your trouble. Elena wanted to refuse. Every part of her body begged for home, for her own bed, for the sight of her mother's face to know she had not worsened in her absence. But the money offered was more than she would earn from Mrs. Aldridge in a week, and her family needed it desperately. She swallowed her exhaustion once more, and agreed. The hours that followed passed strangely, half real and half like a dream she could not quite wake from. She was given a plain gray dress to wear, modest enough to pass unnoticed among the guests, and stationed in a small room, just off the grand ballroom, its door left slightly open so she could hear the music, the laughter, the great swell of voices that came from a world she had never been permitted to enter. She watched through the gap in the doorway as the ballroom filled with color and light, silk gowns in every shade, jewels catching candlelight, the orchestra tuning its instruments in the far corner. She had made some of those gowns herself, stitch by stitch, late into countless nights, and yet she had never once imagined what it might feel like to stand beneath the chandeliers wearing them. It was well past 10 when the Duke arrived at the top of the grand staircase, and the room seemed to shift its entire attention toward him at once. Duke Alaric Ashbourne was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair swept back, and an expression that seemed carved from patience rather than joy. He greeted his guests with practiced warmth, but Elena, watching from her narrow gap in the doorway, noticed something the crowd did not. His eyes did not linger on any single face. They moved past every smile offered to him, searching, though for what, she could not have said. She should not have been watching him at all. She had work to do, gowns to mend if called upon, and yet something about his stillness amid all that noise held her attention, the way nothing had in weeks. An hour passed. Then two. No gown required her attention, and the heat of the crowded ballroom began to seep even into her small room, thick and heavy, mixing with the smell of candle wax and perfume, until the air itself felt difficult to draw into her lungs. Elena had not eaten since the small breakfast offered that morning, and even that had been little more than bread and weak tea. Her body, already worn thin by weeks of sleepless nights, began to protest in ways she recognized, but had always managed to ignore. Her vision blurred at the edges. The music, once clear, began to sound as though it came from underwater. She told herself to sit, to breathe, to wait it out, as she always had. She had done this before, forced her body past its limits through sheer stubbornness, and always it had held. But this time, when she rose to fetch a glass of water from the sideboard near the ballroom's edge, her legs did not hold her at all. The last thing Elena remembered clearly was the sensation of the floor tilting beneath her, the candlelight scattering into streaks of gold, and a voice, low and startled, calling out something she could not quite understand before the world went dark entirely. She did not see who moved first. She did not see the Duke break away from a conversation mid-sentence, nor the way his expression shifted from polite composure to something sharper, more urgent, as he crossed the ballroom floor faster than any Duke was expected to move at his own celebration. She did not see the way the crowd parted around him, murmuring, nor the way he knelt at the ballroom's edge without a single thought for his own fine clothes. She knew only darkness, and then, faintly, the sensation of being lifted, carefully, as though she weighed nothing at all, cradled against someone whose hands were far gentler than she would have expected from a man of his station. Somewhere far away, she thought she heard him say her name, though she had never told him what it was. Elena woke to unfamiliar softness beneath her, a bed far grander than any she had ever lain upon, and for a moment she believed she was still dreaming. The room around her was quiet, lit by a single lamp turned low, its walls lined with paintings she could not name, and shelves of books she would never have time to read. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, and someone had draped a blanket over her that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. She tried to sit up, and a firm but careful hand pressed against her shoulder, urging her back down. "You should not rise so quickly," said a voice she did not recognize. "You gave everyone in that ballroom quite a fright, myself included." Elena turned her head and saw an older man with silver spectacles and a doctor's bag resting on the table beside him. He introduced himself as Dr. Bennett, the family physician, and explained, in the calm and measured way of a man accustomed to delivering difficult truths gently, that she had collapsed from exhaustion, plain and simple. Not illness, not injury, only a body pushed far past what it could endure. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" he asked. "And do not tell me this morning, because I have already spoken to Mrs. Fairweather, and she tells me you took almost nothing." Elena's cheeks burned with shame. "I have been busy," she said quietly. "My family needs me, and there has not been much time for meals." Dr. Bennett studied her for a long moment, then simply nodded, as though he had heard this excuse many times before, from many different people, and had learned there was little use arguing against it directly. "You will eat something now," he said, rising to fetch a tray that had been left near the door, "and you will rest until I am satisfied you can stand without falling again." It was only after he left the room to inform the household of her condition that Elena noticed she was not entirely alone. A figure sat in a high-backed chair near the window, half in shadow, still dressed in the fine dark coat he had worn for the ball, though his cravat had been loosened and his sleeves pushed back, as though he had been occupied with something more urgent than dancing. Duke Alaric Ashbourne rose the moment he saw her eyes were open, and crossed the room with none of the careful, measured grace she had watched him carry through the ballroom hours before. Up close, without the crowd around him, he seemed less like the composed figure who had greeted his guests at the top of the staircase, and more like an ordinary man who had spent the last several hours deeply worried. "You are awake," he said, and something in his voice loosened, as though a held breath had finally been released. "I feared you would sleep until morning." Elena struggled to find words, acutely aware of where she was, whose bed she occupied, and what precisely had happened to place her here. "Your Grace," she began, "I am so sorry. I should not be here. I am only the seamstress who came to see to Lady Constance's gown, and I do not know how I came to trouble you with this." "You did not trouble me," he said, pulling the chair closer to the bedside and sitting without waiting for permission, a small breach of formality that seemed to surprise even him. "You collapsed at the edge of my ballroom, and I would have thought poorly of myself indeed if I had simply stepped over you and continued my evening as though nothing had happened." Elena did not know how to respond to that. In her experience, men of his rank rarely noticed servants at all, let alone carried them from ballrooms with their own hands. She studied him carefully, searching his face for the polite condescension she expected, the kind that so often masked itself as kindness among the wealthy, but found instead only genuine concern, plain and unguarded. "How do you know my name?" she asked finally. "I never told it to you." A faint, almost embarrassed smile crossed his face. "Mrs. Fairweather told me. Once I insisted on knowing who I had just carried through a room full of my own guests. I confess I asked rather more forcefully than was proper." The mention of the guests brought a fresh wave of horror to Elena. "Everyone saw," she said. "Everyone saw you carry a seamstress out of the ballroom. Your Grace, this will be the talk of every drawing room in the city by morning, and I will be the subject of every unkind word attached to it." "Let them talk," he said simply. "I care little for what is said in drawing rooms. I care a great deal more for the fact that a young woman nearly harmed herself working herself past exhaustion, in service to people who scarcely noticed her existence until she fell at their feet." There was an edge to his voice when he said this, something sharper than simple concern, and Elena wondered, briefly, what lay beneath it. But she did not ask. It was not her place to ask a duke about the shadows behind his own words. Instead, she tried again to rise, insisting she needed to return home, that her mother would worry, that she had already imposed far too greatly on the household's kindness. Alaric did not argue with her directly. He simply reminded her, gently but firmly, that Dr. Bennett had ordered rest, and that a carriage would be arranged to take her home the moment the physician deemed her fit to travel, and not a moment before. While they waited, conversation crept in slowly, hesitantly, the way conversation often does between two people who have no reason to trust one another, and yet find themselves drawn to speak regardless. Elena mentioned her mother's illness only in passing, not wishing to burden him with it, But Alaric listened with an attentiveness she had not expected, asking questions that showed he was truly listening, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He, in turn, revealed little of himself directly, though small details slipped through the cracks of his careful composure. A mention of a ball he had not wanted to host, a flicker of something tired in his eyes when he spoke of the many guests downstairs who had come, he said, more for the spectacle of Ashbourne House than for any true affection toward its owner. Elena recognized something of her own exhaustion reflected back at her, though his came dressed in silk and privilege rather than debt and desperation, and she found herself, despite every instinct telling her to remain distant, feeling a strange and unexpected sympathy for a man who wanted for nothing, and yet seemed, in his own way, just as tired as she was. When Charlotte arrived sometime later to help Elena dress and prepare for the journey home, Alaric stepped out of the room to allow her privacy, though he lingered in the corridor rather than returning downstairs to his guests. Charlotte, fastening the final buttons of Elena's own plain dress, glanced toward the door with poorly hidden amusement. "I have worked in this house 3 years," she whispered, "and I have never once seen the Duke sit at anyone's bedside, let alone linger outside a door waiting to see them safely to a carriage. Whatever you did to earn that attention, you should be careful with it." Elena assured her, perhaps too quickly, that she had done nothing at all, that it was simple kindness, and nothing more, the sort any decent person might show another in distress. But even as she said it, some small part of her did not entirely believe her own words. The carriage ride home passed in near silence, though it was not an uncomfortable one. Alaric had insisted on accompanying her personally, over the mild protests of his own household staff, stating simply that he wished to see for himself that she reached home safely. Elena sat across from him in the swaying carriage, watching the city lights pass by the window, acutely aware of his presence in a way she could not fully explain. When they arrived at last outside her family's modest lodgings, far removed from the grandeur of Ashbourne House, Elena felt a fresh wave of embarrassment at the contrast between her world and his. But if Alaric noticed the narrow street, the peeling paint, the small and simple door, he gave no sign of judgment. He helped her from the carriage himself, waving off the footman who moved to assist, and walked her to the door, as though escorting a woman of far greater standing than a seamstress returning home after a long and difficult night. "I hope you will allow Dr. Bennet to check on you again in a few days," he said at the door, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant, a tone she had not yet heard from him. "And I hope, if it would not trouble you greatly, that you might allow me to know how you are recovering." Elena hesitated, torn between the practical voice in her mind, warning her against involvement with a man so far above her station, and something else entirely, something warmer and far less sensible, that did not want this strange night to end so completely. "I would not wish to trouble you further, Your Grace," she said carefully. "You have already shown me more kindness than I could have expected." "It would be no trouble at all," he said. "In fact, I suspect it would be the opposite entirely." He bowed to her then, a small, formal gesture that felt somehow more sincere than any of the polished greetings he had offered his noble guests that evening, and returned to his carriage. Elena stood at the door long after it had pulled away, watching the space where it had disappeared into the dark city street, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember, something other than exhaustion settle into her chest. She did not yet know what it meant. She only knew that something in her carefully ordered, endlessly difficult life had shifted, quietly and without her permission, the moment his hands had lifted her from that ballroom floor. Word of the collapse reached Colford Street before Elena had even finished her first cup of tea the following morning. Mrs. Aldridge stood in the doorway of the small workshop, with her arms folded, her expression unreadable in the way it always was before she delivered something unpleasant. She had heard, from a delivery boy who had heard it from a footman, that the seamstress sent to Ashbourne House had fainted in the middle of the grand ball and been carried away by the Duke himself. She wanted to know, plainly and without softness, whether this was true, and if so, what exactly Elena had done to bring such attention upon herself. Elena explained as best she could, keeping her account simple and factual, careful not to embellish anything that might make her sound as though she had sought such attention deliberately. Mrs. Aldridge listened with narrowed eyes, and when Elena finished, she said only that she hoped this would not become a habit, that a seamstress who drew gossip rather than avoiding it was not good for business. and that Elena would do well to remember her place before it was decided for her. The words stung, though Elena had grown accustomed to swallowing far worse from Mrs. Aldridge over the years. She returned to her work at the frame, stitching hems for gowns she would never wear, and tried to push the previous night from her mind entirely. It seemed the wisest course. Nothing good, she told herself, could come from a seamstress dwelling on the memory of a duke's hands, lifting her from a ballroom floor. But home offered little escape from thoughts of the night before either. When she returned that evening, her mother Margaret was sitting up in bed for the first time in days. Color returned faintly to her cheeks, and Lucy could speak of nothing else but the rumor that had already reached even their quiet street. A duke, Lucy said, eyes wide with the particular delight only a 12-year-old could summon for such news, had carried her sister through an entire ballroom in front of everyone. It was nothing so dramatic, Elena insisted, settling beside her mother's bed and taking her thin hand gently. I only fainted from tiredness, and someone was kind enough to help me. That is all there is to tell. Margaret studied her daughter's face for a long moment, the way mothers do when they suspect there is more beneath a story than has been offered. She did not press the matter, though she did ask, quietly, whether Elena had eaten properly, whether she was sleeping at all, whether the burden of caring for them all had grown too heavy to carry alone. Elena assured her it had not, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. 3 days passed without word from Ashbourne House, and Elena told herself this was for the best. She returned to her routine, the long hours at Mrs. Aldridge's workshop, the walk home in the fading light, the quiet evenings spent caring for her mother and helping Henry with his letters, and slowly, the memory of the ball began to feel distant, almost as though it had happened to someone else entirely. Then, on the 4th day, a carriage arrived outside the workshop that made every head on Colford Street turn. It was not Alaric himself who stepped from it, but a woman Elena did not recognize, dressed with the same quiet authority Elena remembered from Mrs. Fairweather, though this woman was younger, sharper featured, and carried herself with the particular briskness of someone accustomed to managing important affairs. She introduced herself simply as Miss Everley, secretary to the Duke's household, and explained that His Grace had requested, on behalf of his mother the Duchess, that the seamstress who had altered Lady Constance's gown be engaged for further work ahead of the coming season. Mrs. Aldridge, who had emerged from the back room the moment the fine carriage was noticed outside her window, nearly tripped over her own skirts in her eagerness to agree. Elena, she declared, would be honored to accept such an important commission, and would of course be available at whatever hours the household required. Elena said nothing, though her heart beat strangely fast at the mention of the household, at the knowledge that this arrangement, however practical its wording, had almost certainly not originated with any duchess at all. The work itself, when it began the following week, was ordinary enough on its surface. Elena was brought to Ashbourne House twice, then 3 times, to assist with alterations for a series of gowns meant for the upcoming season of social gatherings. She worked alongside Charlotte and another maid in a bright sewing room on the estate's 2nd floor, and for the first 2 visits, she saw nothing of Alaric at all, and told herself firmly that this was exactly as it should be. It was on her 3rd visit that she encountered him properly, in the long gallery that connected the sewing room to the main staircase. He was walking with quick, purposeful strides, clearly occupied with some matter of estate business, when he caught sight of her and stopped entirely, the papers in his hand momentarily forgotten. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and something in the way he said her name, carefully, as though he had practiced it, made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "I had heard you were engaged for the season's work. I confess, I did not expect to see you so soon." "I did not expect it either, Your Grace," Elena admitted, and found herself smiling, despite her intention to remain composed and distant. "Your household secretary was very persuasive with my employer." A faint, knowing smile crossed his face. "I may have suggested the arrangement to my secretary," he said, "and I may have suggested it rather more insistently than was strictly necessary. I wished to know that you were recovering well, and a letter seemed insufficient for the purpose." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain whether to be flattered or alarmed by such open admission. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am grateful for your concern, truly, but I must be honest with you. A friendship between a duke and a seamstress is not something the world looks upon kindly. I would not wish to bring trouble upon either of us." Alaric's expression grew more serious then, and he glanced briefly down the gallery, as though checking they were not overheard, before speaking again, his voice lower and more earnest than before. "I have spent my entire life being told what the world looks upon kindly," he said. "I have been told which marriages are suitable, which friendships are advantageous, which conversations are worth my time, and which are beneath it. I have followed nearly every one of those instructions faithfully, Miss Whitmore, and I have found it has brought me very little happiness in return. I do not intend to add your friendship to the list of things I deny myself simply because it does not fit neatly into what is expected of me." Elena did not know how to answer such honesty. She had expected, if anything, polite reassurances, empty comforts, easily forgotten. She had not expected a duke to speak so plainly of his own unhappiness, nor to place her, a seamstress with ink-stained fingers and a family drowning in debt, among the things he valued enough to defend. Their conversation was interrupted before she could respond, by the arrival of an older woman moving briskly down the gallery, her presence commanding immediate attention even before she spoke. This was Duchess Beatrice Ashbourne, Alaric's mother, a woman whose sharp eyes took in the scene before her, the closeness of their conversation, the flush on Elena's cheeks, with a single sweeping glance that missed nothing. "Alaric," she said, her tone perfectly pleasant on its surface, "Lord Edmund has arrived to discuss the harvest accounts. He is waiting in your study, and has been waiting for some time." Alaric excused himself with visible reluctance, promising Elena he would see her before she left the estate that day, and followed his mother down the gallery. Elena remained standing where she was for a long moment, watching them go, and could not help but notice the way the Duchess glanced back once, briefly, her expression giving away nothing at all, before disappearing around the corner. Elena returned to her work in the sewing room, with her thoughts thoroughly unsettled, uncertain whether she had just witnessed the beginning of something wonderful, or the first quiet warning of trouble she was not yet prepared to face. The commissions continued through the following weeks, each visit to Ashbourne House, bringing Elena and Alaric into each other's company, a little more naturally, a little less carefully, until it no longer felt like an arrangement built on convenient excuses but something closer to genuine friendship. He would find reasons to walk through the sewing room while she worked, asking after her mother's health, listening, with real attention when she spoke of Lucy's quick wit, or Henry's stubborn determination to learn his letters despite his young age. In turn, Elena found herself asking about his own life, gently at first, unsure how much a man of his position might be willing to share with someone so far beneath him socially, and surprised each time by how readily he answered. It was during one such conversation, in the quiet hour before the household settled for the evening, that Alaric spoke of his father for the first time. They sat in the small drawing room where Elena had first woken after her collapse, a fire crackling low in the hearth, a tray of tea between them that Charlotte had brought in and discreetly left. Alaric turned his cup slowly in his hands, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on Elena, in the manner of a man working up to something he did not often speak of aloud. "My father died when I was 19, he said, rather suddenly, and rather badly, in debt to men who cared nothing for the fact that I was still a boy. In truth, whatever my title said otherwise, I inherited this house, these lands, this name, and a great many obligations I did not feel prepared to carry. I have spent 11 years since then, trying to prove I was equal to a role I never asked for." Elena listened quietly, recognizing something familiar in his words, despite the vast difference in their circumstances. "My own father died 2 winters ago," she said. "He left debts as well, though nothing so grand as yours, I am sure. But I understand, I think, what it means to inherit a burden you did not choose, and to spend every day afterward trying to prove you can carry it." Alaric looked at her then, something in his expression shifting, softening, as though he had finally found someone who understood a weight he had carried alone for over a decade. "Perhaps that is why I find myself so at ease in your company," he said quietly. "You do not look at me and see only the title. You look at me and see someone who is simply tired, the same as you." He told her, over the following weeks, of the marriage his mother had long expected him to make, an arrangement with Lady Constance Grieve, whose family's standing and fortune would strengthen the Ashbourne name considerably. It was not a match born of affection, he admitted, but of practicality, the kind of arrangement his mother believed every duke owed to his family's legacy. He had never refused it outright, he confessed, because he had never before found a reason compelling enough to risk his mother's disappointment. Elena listened to this with a strange, uncomfortable feeling settling in her chest, one she did not wish to examine too closely. It was not her place to have opinions about who a duke should marry, and yet she found she could not entirely silence the quiet ache the topic stirred in her. "You do not sound as though you wish to marry her," she said carefully. "I do not," Alaric admitted. "I have spent a great many years convincing myself that wishes have very little to do with duty, and that a man in my position is fortunate simply to have a duty worth fulfilling. But lately," he added, his eyes finding hers across the small space between them, "I find myself wishing for things I had long ago decided were not permitted to me." Neither of them spoke further on what those wishes might be, though the silence that followed said more than words could have. Elena rose soon after, insisting she must return home before her mother worried, and Alaric did not press her to stay, though he walked her to the carriage himself, as he always did, and lingered a moment longer than necessary, before releasing her hand from his. It was Charlotte who first voiced aloud what Elena had been carefully avoiding naming even to herself. "You are in love with him," Charlotte said one afternoon, as they worked together over a particularly stubborn hem in the sewing room, her voice light but her eyes knowing. "And unless I am very much mistaken, he is equally lost where you are concerned." Elena's needle slipped, pricking her finger sharply, and she pressed it quickly to her lips before answering. "That is not possible, Charlotte, and you must not say such things, even in jest. He is a duke. I am a seamstress, with a family to feed and debts to manage. Whatever kindness exists between us, it cannot become anything more than that." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, then returned to her stitching with a small, knowing smile that Elena chose not to acknowledge. But that evening, walking home through the darkening streets, Elena could not entirely convince herself that Charlotte had been wrong. She thought of the way Alaric listened when she spoke, as though her words carried genuine weight rather than polite obligation. She thought of the warmth in his eyes when he greeted her, so unlike the careful, distant courtesy he showed his noble guests. She thought, too, of Lady Constance, of the marriage that awaited him, regardless of whatever quiet understanding had grown between them, and felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over her once more. Though this time, it was not her body that felt tired, but her heart, caught between a hope she had no right to hold and a reality she could not ignore. At home, she found her mother sitting up once more, stronger now than she had been in months, thanks in no small part to the additional income Elena's commissions had brought into their household. Lucy had new shoes for the coming winter. Henry's letters had improved enough that his tutor spoke of him with real pride. Elena reminded herself of these things whenever her thoughts strayed too far toward Ashbourne House, holding tightly to the practical truths of her life, the ones that mattered, the ones that would remain long after whatever strange and fragile connection she shared with a duke had inevitably come to its end. But even as she told herself this, some quiet, stubborn part of her heart refused entirely to listen. It did not take long for the rest of society to notice what Charlotte had already guessed. The first sign came in the form of a comment overheard at the market, two women whispering behind gloved hands as Elena passed, something about a seamstress who had grown rather too comfortable at Ashbourne House. Elena kept her chin up and her pace steady, but the words followed her home regardless, settling uncomfortably in her chest. The second sign was harder to ignore. A letter arrived at Mrs. Aldridge's workshop, addressed not to Elena but to her employer, written in an elegant hand and sealed with wax that bore no name Elena recognized. Mrs. Aldridge read it in silence, her expression growing tighter with each line, before finally looking up at Elena with something between suspicion and concern. "Someone has written to warn me," she said, "that my seamstress has been seen in close and improper company with the Duke of Ashbourne, and that continuing such an arrangement may reflect poorly on my establishment." She did not sign her name, Mrs. Aldridge added, folding the letter and setting it aside, "but I think we both have some notion of who might wish to see you removed from that household." Elena did not need to ask. Lady Constance Grieve had never been unkind to her directly, but there had always been something cold in the way she looked at Elena during their fittings, an appraisal that seemed to measure and dismiss in the same glance. If word of Alaric's growing attachment had reached Lady Constance's ears, it was not difficult to imagine her taking steps to protect what she likely considered her rightful place. Mrs. Aldridge did not dismiss Elena that day, though she made her displeasure plain, warning that any further gossip would force her hand regardless of how valuable Elena's work at Ashbourne House had become to her business. Elena left the workshop that evening, with a familiar weight pressing on her shoulders, heavier now than mere exhaustion. She considered, seriously, ending her visits to the estate altogether. It would be simplest, she reasoned, to protect her family's reputation and her own livelihood by removing herself from a situation that could bring only trouble. But when she arrived at Ashbourne House the following week to explain her decision, she found Alaric waiting for her in the gallery, his expression troubled in a way she had not seen before, and her resolve wavered before she had spoken a single word. "I have heard something of the letter sent to your employer," he said, before she could speak. "I am deeply sorry, Elena. I did not intend for my attentions to bring you difficulty." It was the first time he had used her given name without her title attached, and the intimacy of it struck her more forcefully than she expected. She found herself unable, in that moment, to deliver the careful speech she had prepared about ending their friendship, and instead, simply admitted the truth of her fear. "I do not wish to lose my position," she said quietly. "My family depends on it. And I do not wish for either of us to become the subject of the kind of talk that ruins reputations, rather than simply testing them." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, before he spoke again, his voice low and resolute. "Then let me handle the matter directly," he said. "I will not allow anyone, whatever their intentions, to threaten your livelihood over gossip that concerns my own choices far more than yours." He was true to his word. Within days, a formal commission arrived at Mrs. Aldridge's workshop, not the informal arrangement of before, but an official contract naming Elena specifically as the preferred seamstress for the Ashbourne household's ongoing needs, complete with terms generous enough that Mrs. Aldridge's earlier concerns evaporated entirely in the face of such profitable certainty. Whatever gossip continued to circulate, Elena's position, at least, was no longer in danger. But the deeper trouble did not resolve so easily. Word of the Duke's growing preference for a common seamstress had reached the Duchess Beatrice directly, and one afternoon, while Elena worked alone in the sewing room, the Duchess entered without announcement, closing the door quietly behind her. She did not raise her voice, nor did she need to. Her words carried a precision far sharper than any shout could have managed. "I understand my son has taken a particular interest in you, Miss Whitmore," she said, settling into a chair near the window with the composed stillness of a woman accustomed to controlling every room she entered. "I do not say this unkindly, but I think you understand as well as I do that such an interest cannot lead anywhere lasting. Alaric has obligations to this family, to this name, that exist far beyond his personal wishes. I would not wish to see you hurt when he ultimately does what is required of him." Elena set down her needle carefully, steadying her hands before she spoke. "I have never asked anything of your son, Your Grace," she said, choosing her words with care. "Whatever kindness he has shown me, I have not sought to turn it into something it is not meant to be." "Perhaps not deliberately," the Duchess said, rising once more. "But intentions matter little when hearts are involved, Miss Whitmore, and I have seen enough of my son's expression these past weeks to know that his heart, at least, is already quite thoroughly involved. I only ask that you consider carefully what kindness truly looks like, for a man who cannot simply choose the life he wants without consequence to everyone around him." She left without waiting for a response, and Elena sat alone in the quiet sewing room for a long while afterward, the Duchess's words settling over her like a weight she could not easily set aside. She thought of Lady Constance, of the marriage everyone still expected, of the family legacy that rested on Alaric's shoulders, regardless of what his own heart might wish for. And for the first time since the night of the ball, Elena began to seriously consider whether the kindest thing she could do, for both of them, might be to step away entirely before either of their hearts became any more thoroughly involved than they already were. Elena did not mention the Duchess's visit to Alaric, though she found herself withdrawing slightly over the following days, offering shorter answers, leaving earlier than she once had, hoping the distance might quietly resolve what she could not bring herself to explain directly. Alaric noticed almost immediately. He had grown too accustomed to her openness to mistake this sudden reserve for anything but deliberate retreat, and one evening, as she prepared to leave earlier than usual, he stopped her at the gallery door, with a gentleness that made her resolve falter all over again. "Something has changed," he said. "You have grown careful with me, Elena, in a way you were not before. I would rather know the truth of it than watch you slip away without explanation." She considered lying, offering some small excuse about tiredness or work, but something in his steady, patient gaze made it impossible to hide from him entirely. She told him, then, of his mother's visit, choosing her words carefully, not wishing to place blame where none was truly deserved, only wishing him to understand the weight that now pressed upon her whenever she considered their continued friendship. Alaric listened in silence, his expression darkening slightly at certain points, though his anger, when it surfaced, was directed entirely inward rather than toward her. "I am sorry my mother placed that burden upon you," he said finally. "It was not her place to do so, and I will speak with her about it directly. But Elena, I must ask you something honestly, and I would ask that you answer just as honestly in return. Do you wish to end our friendship because you no longer value it, or because you believe it is what circumstance demands of you?" Elena hesitated, torn between the safety of a convenient excuse and the harder honesty he was asking of her. "It is not that I no longer value it," she admitted finally. "It is that I am afraid of what it might cost us both, if it continues to grow into something neither of us can easily undo." "And what do you believe it is growing into?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more careful, as though he understood the fragility of the moment as clearly as she did. She did not answer directly, though her silence, and the way her eyes could not quite meet his, answered the question well enough on its own. Alaric stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt the warmth of his presence, as clearly as she had that first night in the ballroom. "I have spent 11 years doing precisely what was expected of me," he said. "I have denied myself a great many things I quietly wanted, because duty always seemed the safer, wiser choice. But I find, Elena, that I am growing tired of being wise, if it means losing the one thing in my life that has made me feel like more than simply a title and a set of obligations. I do not know yet how we resolve the difficulties my mother has rightly pointed out to you, but I do know that I do not wish to lose your company simply because it is complicated to keep." It was the closest either of them had come to naming, plainly and directly, what had grown between them over the preceding weeks, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen at the honesty of it, even as practical fear continued to whisper its warnings beneath the warmth of the moment. "I do not wish to lose it either," she admitted quietly. "But I am frightened, Alaric, of what it might mean for both of us if the world discovers just how much this friendship has come to matter." He took her hand then, gently, the same careful gentleness she remembered from the night he had lifted her from the ballroom floor, and held it for a long moment without speaking, as though the simple contact said more than either of them yet felt ready to voice aloud. "Let me worry about the world," he said finally. "You have carried enough burdens alone for long enough. Allow me, at least, to carry this one alongside you." They spoke more openly after that evening, though carefully, aware that whatever understanding had grown between them still existed within a world that offered them very little room for it. Elena told him more of her father, of the quiet grief that still lingered whenever she thought of the debts he had left behind, debts she had spent 2 years working tirelessly to manage. Alaric told her, in turn, of a woman he had once loved in his youth, before his father's death forced him into obligations that left no room for such attachments, a quiet heartbreak he had buried so deeply he rarely allowed himself to think of it at all. "We are both," he said one evening, "more alike than either of us likely expected when you first delivered that gown to my door. Two people who learned early that duty leaves little room for wanting things purely for ourselves." "Perhaps," Elena said softly, "that is precisely why this has become so difficult to walk away from." Neither of them spoke of Lady Constance directly during these weeks, though her presence lingered at the edges of every conversation, an unspoken reality neither felt ready to confront. Elena told herself it was simply a matter of time that Alaric would find the courage to address his family's expectations honestly, and that whatever grew between them would either survive that reckoning or fade quietly away before it could cause either of them lasting harm. She did not yet know how little time remained before that reckoning would be forced upon them both, nor how deliberately someone else was already working to ensure it ended in her own quiet defeat. Lady Constance Grieve was not a woman accustomed to losing what she considered rightfully hers, and by the time whispers of the Duke's growing attachment reached her directly, she had already begun quietly arranging the pieces necessary to end it. She was clever enough not to act openly, A direct confrontation with Elena would only invite sympathy for the seamstress and suspicion toward herself, and Constance understood society well enough to know that subtlety accomplished far more than open cruelty ever could. Instead, she turned her attention toward Alaric's uncle and closest advisor, Lord Edmund Hale, a man who had managed the Ashbourne family's political and financial interests since Alaric's father's death, and who had long favored the match with Constance as the wisest course for securing the family's future. Lord Edmund required little convincing. He had watched Alaric's growing distraction with visible disapproval for weeks, and Constance's carefully chosen words concerning the seamstress's ambitions, her supposed calculations, the damage such an unsuitable attachment might do to the family's standing among their peers, found fertile ground in his existing concerns. Together, they began to plant doubts wherever they might take root most effectively. The first blow came in the form of a rumor, carefully constructed and carefully spread, suggesting that Elena had once boasted to fellow seamstresses about her intentions toward the Duke, that she had spoken openly of securing his affection for the sake of her family's financial troubles, that her collapse at the ball itself had been, some whispered, rather too convenient a way to draw his attention. Elena heard fragments of this rumor secondhand, through Charlotte's worried reports, and felt sick with the unfairness of it, knowing full well she had never spoken such words, yet powerless to prove a negative against whispers that spread faster than any denial could follow. The second blow, more calculated still, came directly to Alaric. Lord Edmund arranged for him to overhear, seemingly by accident, a conversation between two minor gentlewomen discussing Elena's supposed ambitions with knowing amusement, embellished just enough to sound plausible to a man already anxious about his family's expectations. Alaric said nothing to Elena of what he had overheard, though his manner grew subtly more distant over the following days, small hesitations creeping into conversations that had once flowed easily between them. Elena noticed the shift immediately, though she could not name its cause. She asked him gently, more than once, whether something troubled him, and each time he assured her nothing was wrong, though his eyes carried a wariness that had not been there before, a careful watchfulness that felt, to Elena, unsettlingly close to suspicion. Matters came to their sharpest point during a small gathering hosted at Ashbourne House, a modest evening of cards and conversation among the family's closer acquaintances, to which Elena had been invited only to make final adjustments to a gown Constance intended to wear. It was Constance herself who ensured the confrontation occurred, arranging to be alone with Elena in the sewing room under the pretense of a fitting, while ensuring, through careful timing, that Alaric would pass close enough to overhear what followed. "You have played your part well," Constance said quietly, once the door was closed, her voice pleasant on its surface but edged with unmistakable warning beneath. A humble seamstress, exhausted and fainting so conveniently at his feet. "I confess I did not expect such a clever strategy from a woman of your station, though I suppose desperation breeds its own kind of cunning." Elena's hands stilled over the fabric she had been adjusting, shock and anger warring within her at the accusation. "I have never sought his attention through any strategy," she said, her voice low but firm. "Whatever has grown between us has grown honestly, without calculation on my part." Constance smiled thinly. "Perhaps you even believe that yourself," she said. "But you must understand, Miss Whitmore, that regardless of what you believe your intentions to be, the outcome remains the same either way. Alaric will marry me. His family requires it, his position requires it, and no amount of genuine feeling on his part, if such feeling truly exists at all beyond simple pity for your circumstances, will change that reality. I would advise you to spare yourself further heartbreak and step away now, before matters progress any further toward disappointment." It was at this precise moment that Alaric, passing the sewing room door exactly as Lord Edmund had quietly arranged, overheard Constance's final words, though not the full context surrounding them, only enough to catch the phrase, "pity for your circumstances," and Elena's silence following it, a silence he mistook, in that unguarded moment, for confirmation rather than shock. He did not enter the room. He continued down the corridor instead, his expression carefully composed, though something inside him had gone suddenly and unmistakably cold. Elena, unaware of what he had overheard, finished the fitting in tense silence, Constance's warning settling over her like a physical weight. She left Ashbourne House that evening more troubled than she had been in weeks, uncertain whether to tell Alaric of Constance's threats directly, or whether doing so would only deepen a conflict she was increasingly uncertain she had any right to be part of at all. She did not yet know that the damage, quiet and misunderstood, had already been done, nor that the careful trust she and Alaric had built across so many honest conversations was about to be tested by a misunderstanding neither of them yet fully understood. Alaric's manner had grown so distant by the time Elena arrived for her next visit that even Charlotte noticed it, whispering a cautious warning as she led Elena toward the sewing room. "He has been in a strange mood these past days," Charlotte murmured. "Quiet and short with everyone, even his own mother. I do not know what has happened, but something clearly has." Elena found him in the gallery later that afternoon, and the moment their eyes met, she understood at once that something had shifted between them, something far heavier than the careful distance of recent weeks. His greeting was polite but clipped, his usual warmth replaced by a guarded formality that felt, to Elena, like a door quietly closing. "Have I done something to trouble you?" she asked directly, unwilling to let the silence stretch further without addressing it. Alaric was quiet for a long moment before answering, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder rather than meeting hers directly. "I overheard a conversation recently," he said finally, "between yourself and Lady Constance, in the sewing room. I did not hear all of it, but I heard enough to understand that perhaps I have been rather foolish these past weeks, believing something existed between us that was never quite what it seemed." Elena's stomach dropped as understanding settled over her. "Whatever you heard," she said carefully, "I beg you to let me explain the whole of it, because I promise you, whatever conclusion you have drawn is not the truth of what passed between us that day." But Alaric, wounded by weeks of quiet suspicion, carefully cultivated by Lord Edmund and Constance alike, was not yet ready to hear her explanation with an open mind. "I do not wish to make this difficult for either of us," he said, his voice controlled but distant. "I think, perhaps, it would be wisest if our arrangement returned to something more appropriate to our respective positions. I will ensure your commission with the household continues, of course. There is no need for your family to suffer for whatever misunderstanding has grown between us." The word misunderstanding struck Elena as deeply unfair, given that it was he, not she, who seemed to be misunderstanding everything entirely. But pride, wounded and quick, rose up within her before she could correct him. "If that is what you wish, Your Grace," she said, her voice growing as controlled and distant as his own, "then I will not trouble you further with explanations you seem unwilling to hear." She turned and left the gallery before he could respond, her chest tight with a hurt she refused to let show until she was safely away from Ashbourne House entirely. She completed her remaining work for the household with careful professionalism over the following days, avoiding any situation that might require private conversation with Alaric, and when her formal commission concluded at the end of that week, she did not return to the estate at all, choosing instead to resume her work solely under Mrs. Aldridge's direction, however much smaller the income proved to be. Charlotte visited her twice in the weeks that followed, each time bearing careful, worried updates. The Duke had grown even quieter since Elena's departure, she reported, speaking to almost no one beyond what business required, and had begun, much to the Duchess's evident relief, to seriously entertain the long-discussed match with Lady Constance at last. Elena told herself this was for the best, that whatever had grown between them had always been destined for exactly this ending, regardless of how it finally arrived. She threw herself back into her old routine, the long hours at Mrs. Aldridge's workshop, the quiet evenings with her mother and siblings, and tried to convince herself that the ache in her chest would fade in time, the same way exhaustion always eventually gave way, however briefly, to rest. But rest did not come easily. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying their final conversation, wondering what she might have said differently, wondering whether pride had cost her something she would spend the rest of her life regretting. She did not yet know that Lord Edmund's careful manipulation had already begun to unravel on its own, nor that a single overheard conversation, and a single loyal servant's growing unease with what he had witnessed, would soon bring the entire truth crashing down around the very people who had constructed the misunderstanding in the first place. William Fox had served the Ashbourne family for over 20 years, first under Alaric's father, and then under Alaric himself, and in all that time he had never once questioned an instruction given to him by Lord Edmund. But the request that reached him one quiet afternoon, to arrange for a particular conversation to occur within earshot of the Duke at a particular moment, had settled uneasily in his conscience from the very beginning, and it settled more uneasily still as he watched the weeks that followed unfold. He had observed the Duke's growing withdrawal, his quiet unhappiness, the way Ashbourne House itself seemed to have grown colder and quieter since Elena's departure, and William, who had known Alaric since he was a boy grieving his father's death, found he could no longer stay silent about the part he had unknowingly played in that unhappiness. He approached Alaric directly one evening, in the same study where Lord Edmund so often conducted the family's business, and confessed everything plainly. He explained how Lord Edmund had instructed him to arrange the timing of Alaric's walk past the sewing room that day, how Lady Constance had requested the fitting be scheduled at that precise hour, how the entire conversation Alaric had overheard had been deliberately staged for his benefit, though William himself had not known, at the time, the full cruelty of what was being constructed. Alaric listened in silence, his expression darkening with each detail, until finally he asked the question that mattered most. And the words themselves, he said, what Elena said, or did not say, in response to Constance's accusations. Do you know the whole of that conversation, William, or only the part I was meant to overhear? William admitted he had not been present for the full exchange, but he had spoken since then with Charlotte, who had gently pressed Elena for an account of what truly happened, out of concern for her friend's evident heartbreak, and Charlotte had shared it with William only that morning, uncertain what else to do with a truth she felt certain the Duke deserved to know. The account William relayed left no room for doubt. Elena had defended herself plainly against Constance's accusations, had denied any calculated pursuit of the Duke's affection, had in fact been the target of a threat rather than the architect of any scheme at all. Alaric felt the full weight of his own foolishness settle over him as he listened, understanding at last how thoroughly he had misjudged a woman who had done nothing but speak the truth, while he had chosen suspicion over trust in the very moment she had most needed him to believe her. He confronted Lord Edmund that same evening, and though his uncle attempted at first to deny the extent of his involvement, the truth emerged clearly enough, under Alaric's direct and unrelenting questioning. Lord Edmund defended his actions as necessary protection of the family's interests, insisting that Elena's presence in Alaric's life could only ever end in scandal and disappointment, and that he had acted, however deceptively, entirely for Alaric's own good. I do not require protection from honesty, Alaric said coldly, nor from a woman who has shown me more genuine care in a few short months than this family's careful arrangements have shown me in 11 years. You will not interfere in my affairs again, uncle, in this matter or any other. He did not confront Lady Constance directly that evening, choosing instead to allow his anger to settle before deciding how best to address her role in the deception. But his course, at least regarding Elena, was already entirely clear in his mind. He needed to see her, to apologize for the suspicion he had allowed to poison their final conversation, and to make plain, at last, exactly what she meant to him, whatever consequences that honesty might bring upon his family's carefully laid expectations. He arrived at Elena's modest home the following morning, without carriage or announcement, walking the final distance himself in the early light, and found the small street thrown into unexpected disorder. A group of men stood outside the Whitmore family's door, documents in hand, voices raised in argument with Elena herself, who stood in the doorway with her mother's frightened face visible just behind her. It took Alaric only a moment to understand what he was witnessing. The debts left behind by Elena's father, quietly accumulating interest over the 2 years since his death, had finally been called due by a creditor, unwilling to wait any longer, and the men before her were prepared to seize what little the family possessed, unless immediate payment could be arranged, an impossible sum for a family surviving on a seamstress's modest wages. Elena, Alaric said, stepping forward before he had fully decided what he intended to say, only certain that he could not stand by and watch her lose everything, while he had spent recent weeks nursing wounded pride over a misunderstanding that was never her fault at all. She turned at the sound of his voice, shock and exhaustion, and something that might have been fragile hope crossing her face all at once, and for a long moment, amid the chaos of raised voices and frightened family members, the two of them simply looked at each other, the weeks of silence and misunderstanding falling away beneath the sudden, urgent reality of what stood before them both. Alaric settled the matter of the debt within minutes, speaking with a calm authority that silenced the creditor's men entirely, arranging on the spot for the sum to be paid in full through his own household accounts, and insisting further that any remaining paperwork be directed to his own solicitor, rather than troubling the Whitmore family further. The men, recognizing at once the standing of the man now addressing them, departed with hurried apologies, and the small street outside Elena's home fell quiet once more. Margaret, still weak but alert enough to understand what had just occurred, thanked him with tears in her eyes, and Lucy and Henry stood watching, with wide, astonished eyes, at the sight of a duke standing in their humble doorway. But it was Elena's expression that held Alaric's attention most completely, a mixture of gratitude and confusion, and something far more vulnerable than either, and he asked, gently, whether she might walk with him a short distance, so that he could finally explain himself properly. They walked together along the quiet street as the morning light grew stronger, and Alaric told her everything: William's confession, Lord Edmund's manipulation, Constance's carefully staged cruelty, and his own foolish willingness to believe suspicion over trust, in the very moment that had mattered most. "I am deeply sorry, Elena," he said finally. "I allowed doubt to take root where none should ever have grown, and I let pride keep me from you far longer than I should have. I do not deserve your forgiveness easily, but I hope, in time, you might consider offering it regardless." Elena listened to his account with a quiet ache that slowly began to loosen into something warmer as she understood, at last, the full truth of what had truly happened. "I was hurt," she admitted, "that you believed the worst of me so readily, but I understand, too, how carefully it was arranged to make you believe exactly that, and I cannot fault you entirely for trusting people your family has relied upon for years. You are kinder to me than I deserve," he said softly. "Perhaps," she answered, a small smile finally breaking through despite everything. "Or perhaps I simply understand, better than most, what it means to carry burdens that were never truly yours to carry alone." The matter of Lady Constance and Lord Edmund, however, remained to be settled publicly, and Alaric resolved to address it without delay, unwilling to allow either of them further opportunity to interfere in a life he had finally decided. With complete clarity, he wished to build honestly rather than dutifully, he announced. Within days, a gathering at Ashbourne House, smaller than the grand ball of months before, but attended by nearly every family whose opinion mattered to the Ashbourne name, including Lord Edmund and Lady Constance themselves. Elena attended at Alaric's personal invitation, dressed not in the plain grey of a servant, but in a gown of her own careful design, one she had stitched quietly over several evenings once Alaric had asked her, with unmistakable seriousness, to stand beside him that evening, rather than remain hidden in some small room off the ballroom's edge. The whispers began the moment she entered, precisely as she had feared they might, but Alaric crossed the room to meet her without hesitation, offering his arm before the entire gathered company, a gesture that left no room for ambiguity about his intentions. Lady Constance's composed expression faltered visibly at the sight, and Lord Edmund's face darkened with the particular fury of a man watching his careful plans dissolve entirely in a single moment. Alaric addressed the room directly, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom that had once witnessed Elena's collapse and now witnessed something entirely different. "I have spent this evening's preparations deciding how best to address rumors that have circulated about my own household in recent months," he said. "I will not entertain further discussion of a marriage arrangement with Lady Constance Grieve, an arrangement I never truly wished for, and one I understand now, was defended through deception rather than honesty. And I wish it known plainly, before all of you, that Miss Elena Whitmore stands beside me this evening not as any passing fancy, but as the woman I intend to make my wife, if she will still have me after the doubt I allowed to come between us." The ballroom fell into stunned silence, broken only by Elena's soft, astonished breath beside him, before scattered whispers began again, though this time carrying something closer to fascination than scorn. Lady Constance departed the gathering shortly after, her dignity carefully maintained despite the obvious sting of public rejection, and Lord Edmund's influence over the family's affairs diminished considerably in the weeks that followed, his manipulations no longer trusted by a duke who had learned, at considerable cost, the value of honesty over careful arrangement. Elena, standing at the edge of the very ballroom, where exhaustion had once brought her to her knees, felt something entirely different settle over her now. Not the heavy weight of depletion, but a lightness she had not known in years. The particular relief, of finally setting down a burden she had carried alone for far too long. Alaric turned to her then, taking her hand gently in front of the entire watching room, exactly as he had lifted her from this same floor months before, though this time there was no collapse to answer, only a quiet and steady certainty between them both. I once carried you from this ballroom because you had given everything you had to those who barely noticed you, he said softly, for her alone to hear amid the murmur of the crowd. I hope, for the rest of our lives together, to make certain you never again have reason to give so much of yourself that you fall before anyone thinks to catch you. Elena, her eyes bright with a happiness she had long ago stopped allowing herself to expect, simply smiled and let him lead her forward into the light of the very room where their story had first begun.